Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Katie Demali, and I am a program director at the French American Foundation. And I'm very happy to introduce our first webinar of our fall program cycle, which is titled Protecting Elections, Lessons from the American Experience. And so security and cybersecurity in particular is a longstanding topic at the French American Foundation. And we've had a cybersecurity conference that we hold annually, and we've been doing that since 2014. And now that we're, of course, in an election year in the US, we are particularly attuned to the importance of election security. So this is going to be a very timely discussion. I am delighted to have Michael Daniel and Cara LaPointe with us. I'm going to be introducing Cara, the moderator of this discussion, and she will introduce Michael. So Cara LaPointe is a futurist who works at the intersection of technology, policy, leadership, and ethics. She recently joined the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab as co-director, where she focuses on ensuring that autonomous systems are safe, predictable, and secure as they're increasingly integrated into every aspect of our lives. Prior to that, she was at Georgetown's Beck Center, and she created the blockchain ethical design framework as a tool to drive social impact and ethics into blockchain design. She's also held numerous roles over the course of 2 decades in the United States Navy. And she served as an advisor to numerous blockchain initiatives and organizations. And she's also a frequent speaker on blockchain and on emerging technologies. Cara helps lead the Foundation's cybersecurity program. And she's also a member of the Foundation's 2016 class of young leaders. So thank you so much, Cara, and I will leave it to you to introduce Michael and to start us off.
Well, thanks so much, Katie. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I am thrilled to introduce Michael Daniel. So we're very excited that he's here with us today. He is the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. So this alliance is an independent, member-based nonprofit alliance, which is focused on cybersecurity. They especially focus on sharing threat intelligence among their members. So prior to CTA, Michael actually served as a special assistant to President Obama and the cybersecurity coordinator on the National Security Council from 2012 to 2017. So with that, I'd like to welcome Michael to give his opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cara, and thanks for having me here. I'm happy to be here to discuss this topic today. Certainly a very timely one as we head into the fall election season. When we talk about election security, I really think we actually have to think about the fact that it's really multiple interrelated problems that we're facing. And these problems largely stem from a shift that we made in moving our election processes from an analog system to the digital world. And as with almost every other area that you can think of, whether you're talking about finance and banks or our energy system, we didn't really think through what all the ramifications were of making something that was analog, making it digital, and how that actually changed the threat profile that those kinds of activities now face. And we saw this in the federal government in multiple different ways. For example, the Office of Personnel Management intrusion from a number of years ago was largely enabled by the fact that we shifted the clearance process from a paper-based analog one, where files were literally stored in a cave, to one where the files are stored digitally. And when you think about it, the ability of an intruder to get into a cave, like what were the Russians going to do? Send somebody into the cave and stand there at the mimeograph machine, chunking out copies to put into a semi? I mean, it's ridiculous to think about that. But when we shifted those files to be digital, then you could actually access them at scale and steal them at scale in a way that was not really even physically possible before. And so the same thing is happening in our electoral infrastructure. It's just that it's been several years behind some of the other sectors in our countries, in our respective countries, in making that digital shift. So that's one of the reasons why some of these issues are coming to the fore right now. But if we actually start to disentangle the threats that we face to our electoral system, I generally divide them into two broad buckets. And one of them is disinformation, the spreading of information that is either false by accident or deliberately spreading it when you know that it's untrue. And the other is actually disrupting the electoral infrastructure itself, the processes and IT systems that actually enable us to carry out the vote from beginning to end. And so those two threats are actually quite, they're interrelated, but they're quite distinct. And the kinds of countermeasures you need to employ to deal with disinformation is very different than the countermeasures and security procedures you're going to put in place to deal with threats to the electoral infrastructure. They're also they're also very different in how people think about them and what the range of responses are to a particular actor that might try to carry out one of those. Frankly, we actually treat a threat to disrupt the actual voting process much more seriously than we do disinformation. Now, we can have a debate about whether or not that's right, but that is certainly the way that most people approach the problem. I mean, I should note that at one level, just as in other places, these threats are not new. The threats to disrupt the voting process, through either voter fraud or other things that date back to the late 19th century. Those threats have always been there. Disinformation has always been part of the environment. But what is new is the ability to use cyber means to do it with speed, to do it at scale. And so that's what really makes this environment seem new. Now, if we look at those two threads, and I'll take the securing the electoral infrastructure first. When you actually start to think about that threat, you actually have to broaden your aperture. Most of the discussion has actually focused on voting machines. And certainly any individual voting machine is vulnerable. Now we can, there's a whole discussion thread about that, but that we could engage in, and if people want to drill down into some questions on that. But the truth is that actually the voting machines may not, in fact, be the most vulnerable part of the entire infrastructure. Because generally, while they are occasionally connected to the internet, most voting machines spend most of their time not connected and are only rarely plugged into the broader internet. And what that means is that achieving an effect at scale through the voting machines is actually quite challenging. But there are other parts of the of the electoral system that are regularly connected, and in fact may be a greater point of weakness than the voting machines. So, for example, voter registration databases, by definition, if you want to enable people to register to vote, they have to be connected to the internet in today's world, and that opens them up to intruders. Similarly, the reporting system that happens on the other side of after the votes are cast. Those systems are generally reporting over the internet, and so they're more vulnerable to intruders. So you have to actually, when you're thinking about trying to do cybersecurity for the electoral infrastructure, you really have to look at the entire process from beginning to end, from registering voters to actually counting and tabulating and reporting results and certifying those results. Once you do that, then that actually, in some ways, makes the problem much more complex because you actually have a lot of different systems that you're trying to look at. Now, one of the things, though, that is actually true about all of this is that it does not require breakthroughs in physics, primarily just the basics. The cybersecurity that I know that you've talked about in these kinds of forums before equally apply. Things like ensuring that you have multi-factor authentication for the people that can make changes to the voter registration databases. Ensuring that you have, good, strong passwords, that you're using a password manager for those systems and you're not reusing passwords, that you separate duties and don't allow administrator accounts to do non-administrator activities. these kinds of basic processes, basic cybersecurity defensive measures will go a long way towards protecting the electoral infrastructure. And so really emphasizing those basic steps is really what we have to do in terms of the electoral infrastructure. Now, of course, as any good cybersecurity professional will tell you, you will never be able to have 100% security. You will never have a situation where you can prevent all bad things from happening. So therefore, in the electoral system, we also need to be thinking about how do we be prepared? How are we prepared for containing an incident, responding to an incident, and recovering from an incident, and ensuring that any given malicious incident does not undermine the validity of the overall election. And of course, that again, this comes back to something that how these threats are not new. If you actually go back and you look at every election that the United States or any country has ever held, there is always some anomaly somewhere in that voting process. Some precinct did not get the right ballots. Some precinct somewhere had problems reporting its results. Those kinds of anomalies happen in every single election. And so the fact that you have those kinds of anomalies does not undermine the overall validity of the process. And we need to be sure that we're reflecting that in how we are thinking about the security for that actual hard electoral infrastructure. Now, of course, some of the key challenges in doing that security, though, are that in the US, elections are managed at the state and local level. In fact, by some calculations, there are over 8,000 election jurisdictions in the United States. And that means that the elections are being run at a level where resources are highly constrained, and cybersecurity expertise has only recently begun to develop. And so that poses us a particular challenge, particularly in the US, for actually doing that security that I was talking about. And of course, then if you talk about trying to provide assistance to state and local governments, one of the things that is very true about the US is that if you've met one state or city, you've met one state or city. Every single one of them is slightly different, sometimes wildly different. And so the lessons and processes and procedures that work in one jurisdiction are not going to necessarily work in another jurisdiction. And so as a result, the landscape is incredibly complex and resource constrained and very difficult to work with. And then the last thing that I'll just mention in this area is what some researchers, particularly like Ed Felton out of Princeton, have referred to as the valley of death problem, which is that we tend to think about cybersecurity for the electoral infrastructure in the few months that are leading up to elections. However, that's not the point at which state and local election officials can actually make changes and improvements to that electoral infrastructure. Because by that point, they actually have to have all of those systems and processes and data locked for a whole variety of reasons. They can't make changes and updates to it. So they need to be focusing on making those changes and improvements and getting that support and help from other people on the off years, on the off cycles, at different times. But that's not when anybody is actually paying attention to it from a broader social standpoint. So we need to figure out how to overcome that valley of death problem so that we can actually make the investments in our electoral security when not just in the immediate time leading up to elections. Now, on the disinformation side, of course, this threat is really a quite varied one. It keeps evolving and changing. Certainly if you talk with Facebook and Twitter and ask them, what are the threats that they're seeing this time around in this electoral cycle, it's different than what they saw in 2018 and it's different again than what they saw in 2016. And it ranges from the merely suspect to outright fabrications. And I also think the space is getting more crowded. Certainly the Russians aren't the only ones playing at this game. And it's not just foreign actors as well. There are lots of domestic groups that have an axe to grind. And so dealing with this threat is much more is much more challenging, I think, in some ways. You know, first of all, we actually don't really have an idea of its actual impact. It's very difficult to measure, for example, how many people were actually swayed and voted differently in either 2016 or 2018 as a result of being exposed to some of this disinformation. Did it actually have an impact? I mean, logic says that it must, or people wouldn't be trying to carry out these activities, but we really don't have a good way of measuring that, that impact. We also don't have nearly the same level of maturity in terms of what to do about it that we do in cybersecurity basics. At one level, this shouldn't be surprising. We are seeing a fundamental shift in our society from information scarcity to information abundance. And somewhat like the change from food scarcity to food abundance, we haven't really evolved and adapted to deal with this. I mean, certainly even over the course of my lifetime, I'll date myself by saying that, you know, I'm old enough that when I was in high school and starting college, you still had to teach people how to find information. We spent a lot of time talking about how to use a card catalog when you went to the library. When I think about for my children, that is not their problem. They are swimming in a sea of information. And the challenge is actually sorting through the information, that information overload, and actually figuring out what is reliable, what is useful. And so that is a different information challenge than we have ever really faced before. Now you're starting to see the emergence of companies and things that are dedicated to this issue, but this is still a very relative even to cybersecurity, which is still a fairly young discipline. Relative to cybersecurity, this is disinformation and dealing with that is an even younger discipline. And we really don't know what to do with disinformation from a policy standpoint. The issues of who decides and how do we sort out, and all of those questions they're unanswered. Frankly, they're unanswered almost around the world. They're unanswered in Europe. They're unanswered here in the United States. So in questions of, with questions of what do we do about this, in my view, on the electoral infrastructure side, we need to keep investing in cybersecurity, particularly at the state and local level. And we need to provide support to our state and local election officials in deploying known best practices and keeping up with those best practices. In particular, I think that the federal government here in the United States should establish an election security fund, much like the Highway Trust Fund, for funding roads and other kinds of infrastructure projects that states could actually tap on a matching fund basis, on an ongoing period, so they can do planning, rather than these sort of one-off appropriations that tend to lead to a feeding frenzy on the part of, frankly, the cybersecurity industry that's not very helpful to state and local officials. On the disinformation side, I think we need to continue having these kinds of discussions. We need to talk and discuss and thrash out and throw out ideas and pressure test them and see what might work and try different solutions and work through to see how we might be able to actually, tackle this problem of disinformation, and what are we going to be comfortable with as societies, and recognize that, in fact, different societies are going to arrive at different solutions depending on their cultural preferences, and that what works in Europe and in France, for example, and just in this context, is not going to be the same as what happens here in the United States. And figuring out how to then, navigate that internationally will also be part of the challenge. But overall, I would say that this is one of the key policy challenges for us heading into the middle part of the 21st century. How do we deal with these kinds of threats, not just to our electoral infrastructure, but to our critical infrastructures writ large, of which the electoral system is one? How do we deal with disinformation? How do we deal with these emerging technologies and the intersection of all of these issues? So certainly this is a very rich area for conversation, and I think at this point I'll close out my my opening remarks, and we can get into some questions and answers.
That's great, Michael. Thanks so much. And I will invite all the participants right now to put their questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to start off with a few of my own for Michael. So this is really interesting, right? I mean, there's obviously two big areas you've been talking about, the disinformation and then the disrupting actual electoral infrastructure. And you make a really good point that people focus a lot on voting machines, yet they're often not the weak link because they're not the ones that are connected. And so the issues of voter registration databases and that process, and then the reporting of vote results. So you started to talk about solutions. I'm really interested, having worked on blockchain in the past, do you think there's a role for blockchain, particularly in those two areas?
I do, actually. I think that some of those solutions, sort of that distributed ledger concept actually could be very beneficial to both of those. One of the challenges, right, we had with blockchain was when it first came out, it sort of, it took on the shiny new object syndrome, as I refer to it. And it was like, it slices, it dices, it does Julian fries, it can solve all of our problems. And, it tended to get oversold. But in fact, it actually does have very legitimate security, uses. And I actually think the two that you cited there could be good places to look at using blockchain.
Yeah, but we know technology itself is never a solution in and of itself, right?
Right.
It's part of a larger solution, and that human interface for how you kind of record is important. So that leads me to another question, is that both for the disinformation and even for the electoral security, have you thought about the importance of civic tech models or the idea of participatory development where you bring communities in, because you're talking about these discussions, right? So there would be potentially a possibility to bring communities in and have them talk about what their priorities are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that that's really, that has to be part of the process, right? How do we think about this, and how do we get people to actually think about the information that they're consuming, right? And that's not something that you can mandate, right? That has to be done through experience and through, the analogy I also use for here in the United States, right? If you go back and you look at advertising from the late 19th century, a lot of it looks really clunky to us today, right? We look at that and we're like, how did anybody ever buy that? Really? Seriously? And it's because we're so much more sophisticated now. And if you ask any American, do you believe everything that you see in advertisements? The answer would be obviously not. We're trained from the time we're 4 years old to discount what advertisers are telling us, right? And I think we just need to begin to bring that same kind of sophistication to how we consume other kinds of information. And that those same skill sets, we just need to develop them in other areas.
Yeah, but it's interesting. I was interested that throughout your talk, I didn't really hear the word trust very much. And trust is kind of a central piece of this all. If you look at the research on trust, the trust of the public in institutions in general is at an all-time low. In government, it's very low. In companies, it's actually starting to be very low, which, traditionally in the US, people trust companies a lot, but because of everything going on. So how do you even begin to do this if you don't have that that pact between citizens and government and industry?
Yeah, and I think that you raise a very good point. Within CTA, we talk about trust a lot, about you can't do effective cybersecurity and cybersecurity information sharing unless you have trust. And I think similarly, most of our, the confidence in the electoral, in our electoral system is based on trust, right? And I do think that we need to think about how you build systems that actually reinforce and build trust as part of any processes that we put in place. You can't sort of wish trust into existence, right? It has to be earned over time, and it has to be earned by actually demonstrating it and carrying out and adhering and having people adhere to the rules, and agreeing upon a set of rules and then having people actually adhere to it. And there's just really no substitute for that. But I do think that you can use technology, you can use processes, you can use business rules to reinforce and make it transparency, right? To promote transparency so that people don't have to take on faith that people are adhering to the rules. They can see that people are adhering to the rules, right? And so that's the way that you continue to build trust. And I think that those are really the main tools that we have.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge. Well, that leads into one question we've got from our audience in terms of, can you talk a little bit about the specific threats that you're seeing? And you basically mentioned that solutions for the electoral problem have to happen in off-election years. Obviously, we're not there. So what can we do at this point with so little time left to the elections?
Yeah, so I think that what's been interesting is that certainly based on the reporting that I am seeing out of the U.S. government with respect to the U.S. presidential election, we are seeing a lot less activity on the aimed at the electoral infrastructure side. Now, whether that's because the adversaries have gotten more subtle or the activity is not there, that's always one of the hard things to sort of suss out. But certainly that seems to be less of a focus this time. And our member companies within CTA would certainly tend to agree with that assessment. On the other hand, I think the level of disinformation and those kinds of activities certainly seems to, if anything, have only accelerated. And I think that's where you begin to get into the real question of, so one of the interesting ways that it appears to have evolved, right, is that so just take what Facebook tends to call inauthentic behavior, right? So accounts that are not actually who they say they are, right? Well, those now are more sophisticated, but they're at a smaller scale, right? So they're harder to find, they're harder to detect, but as a result, they're connecting to fewer people. Because if they connected broadly, they would be easier to identify. Okay, but if they're connecting to fewer people, does that mean they're having a smaller impact? So there's a lot of these questions that are, I think, very complex to dig out. I think in terms of what we can do on the electoral side, I think the main thing at this point is to actually be ready to support state and local election officials if a problem is detected. And I think the federal government is doing a good job with this. This is one area where I think the DHS, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, headed by Chris Krebs, deserves an enormous amount of credit. They have really done some fabulous work here. And it's one of the, despite everything else that's going on inside the US government, this area is one place where I think they have really done a good job of providing that support and staying on top of this issue with the state and local governments. Similarly, like within CTA, we actually have formed an election security working group of the cybersecurity companies that actually can provide those kinds of services. And that working group stands ready to share information on threats to the electoral infrastructure and respond if an incident starts to unfold. At this point in the process, that's the main thing that we can really do. And I think, again, sort of reinforcing that message that just because we might detect a problem does not mean that the whole election is invalid. Right, that being ready to sort of contain those problems and respond to them as they arise is really important.
That is important. And in a second, we're going to come back to this, making sure that people don't feel like the election's invalid. But first, I want to jump back to a point that you just said in terms of, it's interesting when you're talking about Chris Krebs at CISA over at Department of Homeland Security, you said he's working with state and local governments. That may surprise a lot of people that the federal government, in order to provide electoral security, is working with state and local governments, especially because this is the French-American Foundation and we think about things at the national and international level. Can you talk a little bit about the state-run nature of election security, and what that means in terms of us being able to extrapolate lessons learned from that, and even, you know, best practices.
Yeah, so this was actually one of the things that I really didn't appreciate nearly as much until you know, my experiences back in 2016. That in the United States, under our system, for some very good reasons that work for us, our elections are managed at the state and local level. And one of the interesting things about it is that every single state manages that process slightly differently. And in some states, it's actually even not done at the state level at all. It's done completely at the local level. And so the result is that if you want to, there is no federal role. There is no federal role in directly managing those processes. Now, over time, we have taken steps to say, you know, the federal government has a role in ensuring that the states are adhering to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, for example. So there is a part of the Justice Department that monitors elections and provides advice and best practices for how to ensure that you're complying with the Voting Rights Act. So it's not that there is no federal involvement at all, but the primary owners and operators of that part of our critical infrastructure are state and local governments. And so this means that you have to build those relationships. Now, here's one other little wrinkle, which is that we had spent years developing relationships with the state chief information officer, you know, the CIO's offices, which most states have. Turns out in virtually all of the states, the state CIO office has nothing to do whatsoever with elections. That's usually the Secretary of State's office. Usually, again, not always. So when DHS had to start getting involved in elections, they had to go build a whole new set of relationships from the ground up. And as you were talking about trust, in every industry that I have seen, the initial contact between the federal government and that industry, whether you're talking the financial services industry, the healthcare industry, the energy industry, the initial contact between the federal government and that industry in cybersecurity went poorly. And there was distrust, there was lack of communication, there was miscommunication, and that was true in the electoral sector as well. And so what we've been spending the last 4 years doing is building that trust that you were talking about, building those relationships, and learning how, you know, learning what each side brings to the table. Now, what this means, though, is that given this incredibly complex set of circumstances and systems and people and processes, transferring lessons from one to the other is really hard. And sort of beyond kind of the cybersecurity basics that I mentioned, you really have to actually marry up cybersecurity expertise with the expertise at the local level about how that jurisdiction actually does its business. And there's just no substitute for that. In fact, if you actually, you know, if you actually talk to some of the folks at some of our member companies who've spent a lot of time on cybersecurity, you know, they will tell you that they have visited places in this country that they never anticipated that they would need to go to, because they actually had to get involved at that local level and really spend time with the state and local officials to understand what they needed and how to actually help them. And so I think the implication is that I'll take that then in the other direction to the international level. I would be very, very wary of taking any of the lessons and solutions from the US context and trying to apply them into, say, the French context. There might be some, and certainly some of our adversaries, like the Russians, would just as dearly love to disrupt the French electoral process as much as the US electoral process. But in terms of you know, how the French run, you know, how France runs its elections is completely different than the US. And, you know, I would be very, very careful before I said anything and would want to spend a lot of time studying that and understanding those processes in that cultural context before I made any, recommendations going in, crossing outside of the US.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So this leads into another question we have from the participants in terms of, does international cooperation and dialogue exist on this specific subject? If yes, what is it, or would be the ideal arena, the UN, G20 bilateral discussions? So I'll add on to that, given what you've just said about electoral security, is disinformation the place for us to have those international discussions?
So I certainly think that is, interestingly enough, that's probably going to bear some more, there's going to be more similarities across, again, still differences because of the cultural differences and things like that. But given the global nature of some of the platforms like Facebook and Twitter and some of the shared underlying culture that exists, particularly between the United States and Western Europe, you actually are probably going to see more similarities and more opportunity for sharing. I certainly think that there is definitely opportunity, right? There are limited ways that adversaries can access voter registration databases, right? There are limited ways that you can carry out certain malicious cyber activity. And so certainly sharing those adversary playbooks, those adversary tactics and techniques and procedures, that has utility. Certainly saying, things to look out for. Here are some indicators that if you find these on your system, on your systems, you might want to look for whether or not you've got, a breach. That kind of sharing is actually quite useful across jurisdictions, right? And even saying these are the kinds of practices that we have found useful, that can be valuable information. And I would argue that all of those options, the UN, bilateral, G20, all of those should be pursued.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So I want to loop back now a little bit to what you had said before in terms of the public perception of election security. I think folks are rightly worried about this fall with their elections, that there's the issue of actual electoral security, and then the issue of the perception of the validity of the process, the validity of the voter rolls, and the validity of the results. So I'd love to hear you speak to that and about the role kind of of cybersecurity in that, all of that.
Yeah, and I think that it's very important for us to continue to reinforce the message that and to focus on the ensuring that, broadly speaking, that Americans can retain confidence that the results that are reported fairly reflect the votes that were cast, right? And that people were not disenfranchised, and further, that people were not disenfranchised as the result of cybersecurity failures or malicious cyber actions, right? Some of that is also reinforcing the point that we are not going to have 100% success, right? There are going to probably be some anomalies in a few places, but just because you have some discrepancies and anomalies in some limited locations does not undermine the validity of the entire process. And that the cybersecurity industry and experts stand ready to help in any way we can. And that we stand ready to respond to those incidents, to contain them and prevent them from becoming broader if they're actually identified. And I think that's going to be really, really important for both the governments and also particularly the nonprofit sector and organizations like CTA to be ready to and the other organizations that are dedicated to this. To these efforts to actually, stand ready to help. But I think that I actually think that we've made a lot of progress since 2016. If I look back at the level of engagement that we had compared to, I don't think you could ask a Secretary of State today in a local jurisdiction, is there a cyber threat to the elections? None of them are going to say no, right? At this point, they're all going to say yes. And so I think even just having that level of awareness is a huge step forward.
That's good. It's interesting you talk about the roles of government and then nonprofits, but yet we talked earlier about some of the tech industry, right? And that they have a role to play as well. And I think it's been obvious over, especially around the 2016 election, that they felt less comfortable really having a role to play in this. Yet you talked earlier about the inauthentic behavior and how some of the social media companies are better at ferreting this out. So I'd just be interested to hear your opinion and thoughts about the role that industry has to play, how much they've embraced that, and how well that's going.
Yeah, I think that there are multiple issues sort of in here. And so, one element of the electoral process that we really haven't talked about are political parties, right? And campaigns. And it's fairly obvious that political parties and campaigns are significant targets, but obviously providing protection to campaigns and political parties is inherently political at some level, right? And so, very much, the ability and sort of level of comfort that cybersecurity companies have with providing those services has been, it's been very low, and they want to be very careful on that score. So that's why it's good that there are organizations like Defend Democracy that have grown up where they can provide sort of that neutral ground to engage with the campaigns and link them up with, cybersecurity services on a nonpartisan, non-political basis. So, we need to, grow more of those kinds of organizations. But I also think that on the disinformation side, right, this is what we were talking about earlier, like who are we going to be comfortable with doing that kind of content moderation, right? And Facebook has been very, judicious in sort of exercising that authority because it wants to be very careful in that sense. But what we refer to, one of the other examples is, what China often refers to as a crime, we call free speech. And so, there's a lot of friction that's developing there. But that is even true between countries that are actually quite close. There is behavior in speech that is not allowed in Germany that we would call free speech here in the United States. Now, we're at an extreme, right? The United States is at one end of the spectrum, and we're very extreme in this regard. But what this shows you is there's an enormous spectrum of activity and speech and behavior in here that it's going to take us a long time to work out the norms of what we're comfortable with and who do we want to be involved in that process. And we'll use that word again that you brought up earlier. Who do we trust to make those kinds of judgments, right? And I think that this is going to be one of the great political and policy debates of the 21st century. This issue right here of how do we actually moderate some of those discussions, right? And how do we not stifle voices? How do we, but yet at the same time, how do we actually deal with the actively malicious behavior? And I certainly don't have those. I certainly don't have those answers. And I think that it is going to be, but I think based on our previous experience in other areas, it's going to be a combination of policy and procedure and process and technology. And it's going to vary from country to country and culture to culture, depending on what they're, depending on what they're comfortable with.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting in terms of the landscape that you talk about, the cultural norms, which comes up against a globalized internet and digital
Right.
community that we all live in, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
tons of things in there, but I want to come back a little bit to this minefield that you've talked about, where any cybersecurity actor is playing in this area where you're trying to be apolitical and nonpartisan, and it's really challenging. There's one area online that has really been politicized often, and it's deep fakes. We're seeing more and more deep fakes. So I'd love your thoughts on what role the cybersecurity enterprise should be playing in identifying deep fakes, especially when it's been so politicized.
Yeah, I mean, I think as sometimes I tell as I used to tell my colleagues when I was in government, and I tell my member companies now when we're talking about things, sometimes you just have to play it straight, right? You just have to say, all right, we are going to identify when we can, we will make an effort to identify that kind of behavior and call it out, no matter where it comes from, right? No matter which side it's coming from or who it supports or what it tries to denigrate. The only way to deal with that from a cybersecurity company standpoint is to take that issue head on and say, we're not trying to favor one side or the other. But when we come across this, we are going to, identify it to the best of our ability. In my mind, that's the only way that you can maintain the integrity in the system. And you are always going to be accused of bias and, by the extremes on either side. And the only way to maintain your integrity is to play it as straight as you can on those kinds of issues. I do think that, it's interesting how this could play out though from, dealing with information, and again, we'll come back to that trust word, which is, we've gotten very used to over the last, I would say 20 or 30 years of, video, for example, being irrefutable proof. And we are now going back we're now moving into a place where it's not irrefutable truth. And you're going to have to consider the video evidence along with, testimony and other things that we all know has some biases and selective memory and other things, for example. And yes, that's more challenging, but I think it's also the reality of the world that, we live in.
Yeah, so this goes back to earlier in your remarks, and you were talking about disinformation and how it's really hard to measure. What is it? Where is it, right? We talked about kind of blockchain as a technology that may help with electoral security. So maybe there's something to kind of tracking pieces of information, but still the basic information, is it trustworthy? Is it reliable?
Right.
Right. So what are the metrics? Like, how could we even start to measure this? What are some metrics we could use? What are some techniques? And I know it's really hard, but what are some processes or procedures or technologies we could use?
I think some of it, I think, has to, we have to draw on other disciplines in other areas, right? And we have a long tradition in the West of, for example, using the scientific method to, is it repeatable? Can you verify it from multiple sources and multiple dimensions, right? We allow those ideas and things to evolve and change over time as a result of the input of new information. And I think that again, this is one of those things of shifting from, taking the fact that we've shifted from this information scarcity model to this information abundance model. So make that work for us, right? And, start to actually say that, I'm really only going to look at this if I can really get at this information from multiple different angles, right? And then I think that the real challenge in my mind, comes back to, are there ways that we can use, for example, what we've learned out of advertising and sort of those kinds of disciplines to look at the disinformation side, and saying, can you get some measures that way? I would say that, we should all be a little bit humble in that regard. I mean, if you still look at advertisers still measure it sort of in eyeballs on, you know, on a web page or on an advertisement, but still, does that really mean that, you know, because that thing had a Super Bowl ad that really people are buying more Doritos? You know, there may be just some, there may just be some limits to what we are going to be able to know in this space, and we should be mindful and humble about that.
Yeah, that reminds me, there's been some really interesting research that came out of UPenn, I think it was at the Annenberg School of Communications, about, you know, from just communications professionals seeing the effect of potential disinformation, right?
Yeah.
Online. Very fascinating. So we only have a little bit of time left, so I encourage, if there are any other participants who have other questions, to make sure you put them in the Q&A. Meanwhile, I want to take this up to a very general level for a second. So one of the things you talked about, which is fascinating, is that when we're talking about protecting electoral infrastructure, which is critical infrastructure, one of the most important things we can do is password protection. Right. So we
Yes.
often think of like really complicated, you know, we need complicated solutions to these complicated problems. And fundamentally, password protection is one of the existential threats, or, you know, existential,
Yep.
you know, ideas and solutions that we have in society. So I'd love it for you to talk to the audience a little bit just about password protection and what individuals can do to make sure they're keeping systems secure.
So the number one thing that you can do with your passwords is use a password manager. Absolutely. So, and there are a number of them out there that actually do a very good job. You know, Dashlane, you know, Keeper, you know, there's multiples of them, right? But that is the single best thing you can do with your passwords, right? Because there is, you know, passwords, like, I mean, if I had my way, we would kill the password dead as a security tool, because it's, you know, most people's passwords are lousy, and you know, they get reused all the time, and it's terrible. But so that's why I actually recommend using a password manager, because if you actually think about it, what we tell people to do in passwords is ridiculous from a human psychology standpoint. Because what cyber nerds will tell you to do is, you're like, okay, so use a 16 to 20 character password that is not a known word in any known language, and include a in there as well. And by the way, don't reuse any of them ever. I mean, if you're like me, you've got, you know, 150, 200, you know, passwords that you're actively managing at a given time. Right. No human is actually going to be able to do that. So you have to use some technology to help you with that. And so the number one tool that's available for that is a password manager. And then you only have to remember one, or maybe you have a password manager for home and business, so then you have two that you're really remembering, right? You know, and that most people can handle. And then the other piece is, don't just rely on the passwords. You know, use that multi-factor authentication. You know, yes, I know the real cyber nerds will tell you, oh, you know, text message is not the best thing. I guarantee you it's better than just username and password, right? Yes, there may be some threats in that, you know, text messaging is the second factor. Okay, fine, but it's better than, you know, just using a username and password. If you do those two things, if you use a username and, you know, use a password manager and use multi-factor authentication wherever you can, for the vast majority of people, that will actually shut down a lot of what the bad guys will try against you. And then you're left with dealing with the phishing emails and other kinds of psychological manipulation. And that's again, that comes back to a different problem. But, you know, doing those two things will actually, that'll knock out a lot of the threats coming against you.
That's great. It's funny how many movie plots these days depend on somebody finding the password written down by the computer, because nobody can remember all their passwords. No, that's really good advice. I know we're coming to near to the end of the hour, but I just do want to ask you, so if we were to get rid of passwords, what would we replace it with? Biometrics? You know, what's the alternative?
Yeah, so I think this has been the big question mark that everybody has had. And I think the biometrics is certainly a piece of it, but I also think that there is technology related to how people interact with the systems, and I think it's being a lot more holistic in sort of behavioral models and other things about how people interact with the technology, and you know, because biometrics have their weaknesses, right? Because at least if someone steals your password, you can change it. Like if someone steals the information about your fingerprints, that's very, very difficult to change. So you never want to just be relying on the biometrics alone. But what you want to be doing is combining that information with other information about behavior, about interaction, and building that up over time to use that as the primary, security methods. And it's similar, I think, to how, credit card companies have gotten incredibly sophisticated about being able to detect, fraudulent activity on your accounts, right? And we need to be in those, using similar kinds of algorithms and technology in the basic security methods. But I really think that we really want to think about all the different ways we can reduce the security burden on individuals as much as possible, so that we're not asking as much of people to be secure, and really putting much more of that burden on the experts and on the other parts of the ecosystem, if you will.
Well, that's great, Michael. This has been an amazing conversation. I would love to just give you a couple minutes if you want people to just have a couple takeaways about election security. What should people take away from this conversation?
So I think a couple of things. One is that you should actually come away with at least a little bit of optimism. I know that's a strange thing for a cybersecurity guy to say. We're not usually the most optimistic people in the world, but I actually think that these problems are not, they're not overwhelming. They're not unsolvable. That in fact, employing some of the basic cybersecurity techniques, being aware of the issues actually does have an impact. It reduces the ability of the adversaries to have an effect. And we have been working really hard. State and local officials and the federal government, everybody has actually been putting a lot of time and effort into this issue. And so you should actually have some confidence that the people that should be paying attention are in fact actually paying attention. Second, I would say that to hit on that point again, that just because we have some issues and just because, for example, we may not be able to fully count the vote on the night of election does not mean the whole thing's invalid, right? That you can still retain confidence in the overall electoral process, even if there are some anomalies. And then the last thing is we need to begin to invest in the long-term cybersecurity of our electoral system and think about ways to combat disinformation over the long term. These are, if you will, sort of permanent problems. And they are not going to be solved, they're going to be managed. And we need to begin to think about them in that way and look at it as a way of doing risk management in this area and really have a long-term investment and a long-term dedicated plan to dealing with it.
Excellent. Well, I know you've given me some hope about the elections and cybersecurity thereof, and really appreciate your time today. It's been absolutely my pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you both, Cara and Michael, for this really insightful webinar. I know the first thing I'm going to do after this is look up password manager systems. I just wanted a quick note that the next public webinar from the foundation will be held next Thursday, September 10th at 1 p.m. And it will be a celebration of the winners of this year's Translation Prize, which is an awards program that the foundation has managed since 1986. So thank you, Cara and Michael, again. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.